There was a lot of fear-mongering going around that the heat shield on Artemis 2 was not going to work. And while at this point we all know that it did a fine job, much of that discourse came, what I think, is from a place of misunderstanding, which stemmed predominantly from the results seen during Artemis 1. But before we get into that, let's have a look at why heat shielding is needed and a little bit about how it works. And to get started on this, I would like to introduce you to the concept of aerobraking. Now, for this example, we will stick with re-entering Earth's atmosphere, but this technique is used elsewhere as well, with one example being when landing rovers on Mars. In any case, when a spacecraft is re-entering Earth's atmosphere, it is going fast. Very, very fast. To give some examples of this, in order to stay in orbit, the ISS is traveling at around 17,500 miles per hour. This means that a spacecraft taking astronauts home would be re-entering the Earth at roughly that speed. The Artemis 2 crew was moving even faster when returning from the moon, going around 24,000 miles per hour. Now, with those speeds comes tremendous amounts of kinetic energy. Energy that must be shed somehow. One way to achieve this would be retro rockets, and in this event there would be no burning up to begin with, because it is not entering the atmosphere that causes an object to burn up, it is the speed at which it is doing so. With that said, the amount of fuel needed to achieve that, and at the end of a mission no less, would be either very prohibitive or possibly even unfeasible, as with more fuel adds more weight, which then calls for more fuel to be lifted into orbit to begin with. So you get stuck in this cycle, right? You add more fuel, you increase the weight, then you need to expend more fuel to launch that weight. And so, enter aerobraking. By making use of the Earth's atmosphere to slow a spacecraft down, it allows us to shed those large amounts of kinetic energy without expending fuel. However, this generates a lot of heat, with temperatures reaching up to 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So this approach lets us decelerate a spacecraft safely and bring it to a more manageable speed, switch between orbits when necessary, and as I just mentioned earlier, save fuel. However, by converting kinetic energy to that amount of heat, we must protect what is inside the spacecraft. In crewed missions especially, this is paramount, and so it is where the heat shield comes in. The heat shield on Orion and Apollo before it is made of an ablative material called Avcoat. However, their exact composition is not the same. There's a few reasons for this: improved manufacturing, environmental rules, health safety, etc. To give an example of this is that in the Apollo era, Avcoat included asbestos, which has been removed in the newer version. It was at first built in the same way, using these cock-like guns seen on screen, and this largely was due to the fact that the knowledge of assembly in this way was already in place. And while it did work, it brought into question the efficiency of this method. Ultimately, NASA settled on making use of modern machines to cast tiles of Avcoat that could then be placed near perfectly on the structure beneath them. Along with this, the spacecraft does have additional means of managing heat, but for this example, we will focus on the Avcoat tiles. Now, you might be wondering, what even is ablation? And this term describes the removal or destruction of an object or part of an object via chipping, erosion, or vaporization. This process sheds heat in various ways while also consuming the spacecraft's kinetic energy. When the heat shield, the Avcoat, which is typically made of plastic resins carbon, or silicon, is superheated, its outer surface becomes gaseous. The blowing that comes from this reaction creates a protective boundary layer that physically lifts heat away from the spacecraft's hull, cooling the area near the vehicle's wall. This is known as the blowing effect, and it is just one way in which ablative heat shields work. With this basic understanding, let us have a look at what happened during the re-entry of Artemis 1. Now, one big advantage of this mission is that it was uncrewed, so with no astronauts on board. What this did, right, was allow NASA to take risks that it otherwise simply would not have taken. One of the things that they tried with this was the skip entry seen on the screen. What we are looking at here is that during Artemis 1's re-entry, it came in at an angle that first had it bouncing or skipping off the Earth's atmosphere and into an arc that then brings it into a shallower descent. This was done so that NASA could test a new, safer landing technique, and some of the advantages with this descent profile is that it reduced the G-forces and overall heat loads that the crew would undergo. It also provided more control as to where the splashdown could occur. Once again, this was the perfect testing ground because there was no crew on Orion at the time. But it is also the quote-unquote cause for alarm when it came to Artemis 2 because the heat shield experienced unexpected char loss due to the descent profile. So rather than ablating evenly, it lost chunks of the material in some sections to a greater extent than in others. The cause of this ended up being the heating conditions, the specific heating conditions created by performing the skip maneuver. Now, we mentioned earlier that part of the heat shield's method of removing heat was through an outer layer of gas created as the material ablates. Keep this in mind as we will come back to it. But to touch on NASA's investigation of the heat shield after landing, it included taking samples from the heat shield, reviewing imagery and data from onboard sensors, and comprehensive ground testing and analysis. One of the tests they underwent was to replicate the conditions of the skip entry on the ground using the NASA Ames Arc Jet Complex, which is basically a wind tunnel that they can superheat the air being flung at the heat shield in with different methods of heating. So this really lets them somewhat replicate the conditions, right, that the heat shield would be going through on entry. They even tested the heat shield at much higher temperatures than what Artemis 1 experienced. What this revealed is, again, that due to those specific heating conditions created by the skip maneuver, the outer gas layer was unable to escape safely, creating additional stress. This came about because the material ended up lacking sufficient permeability for this, which led to internal pressure and cracking. And that's how the spots with extra chunks coming off, had that stress to cause that. The conclusion was that with a change in the trajectory for Artemis 2, the current heat shield would have no issues with keeping the crew safe. Because the Orion spacecraft for Artemis 2 had already been completed by the time these tests were done, it was to move forward with the same heat shield design. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman has noted, though, that the design will be improved for future Artemis missions and to help allow things like that skip entry to be possible. Now let's go over the changes made to the entry profile for Artemis 2 that helped guarantee the crew's safety, and I will have this up on the screen as well. The reason a change in trajectory was effective was due to the heating profile of the entry itself. So one of the main things that the tests performed on the ground between Artemis 1 and 2 had revealed is that the uneven ablating was caused by a heating cycle that came about from that skip maneuver. So with a more straightforward descent and no cooling section on the heat shield, the material performed as it was originally expected to. This also meant that the Orion spacecraft spent less time in the hottest sections of the atmosphere. And when we look at this timeline, we really can see just how quick it was. Now, while this resulted in a rougher ride and a splashdown that was farther away from the shore, again, it also allowed the Avcoat to perform under optimal conditions, and even further guarantee the safety of the crew. So while this was certainly the most dangerous part of the mission, as we can see, the crews at NASA had done their due diligence. They really knew what they were doing going into this, and they had a plan in action that made this descent safe for everyone involved. So this really was a very high-level overview of what was going on here and the technologies involved, but I really just wanted to give, a little bit of a background on what we were going to be talking about. And really, the main takeaway that I would like to see from this video is to just do your due diligence when reading things online. This is going to sound crazy. I know. Sit down. This is going to be crazy. Not everything you read on the internet is true. And so before jumping on board with things that you see, I would implore you to really do a little bit of research. Read into what's really going on. Educate yourself as much as possible before making a judgment call. And this is something that I did during the Artemis 2 mission. Again, as of this recording, it's definitely over by now. We can see the heat shield worked. The astronauts are safe. But during the mission itself, while I was aware that the re-entry was the most dangerous part, I was also aware that NASA had a solid understanding of their product, of what they'd put together, and they had a game plan in action that was going to bring the astronauts home safe. And so again, when viewing things online, if it seems like it might be fear-mongering or clickbait or people just wanting to get attention, before jumping on board with that, do your best to educate yourself on what's going on. And so with that, I hope each and every one of you have an excellent rest of your day, and I would implore you to step outside tonight and look towards the stars.